Welcome to the Behind the Grantmakers Curtain series. This collection of interviews with different foundations aims to help grant seekers craft more effective grant proposals that win funding. This series is brought to you by Instrumentl, the institutional fundraising platform. If you're looking to bring grant prospecting, tracking, and management to one place, you can do so with Instrumentl. On average, nonprofits apply for 78% more grants within a year, helping them win more grants. To do the same and find new good fit funders for your nonprofit, try Instrumentl 14 days free by visiting www.instrumentl.com. That's www.instrumentl.com. Now, let's jump into today's show.
Today's conversation features the president and CEO of a community foundation based out of California. We explore a ton of different things, especially in relationship to looking within your organization, what it means to define your organization's DNA, live it day in and day out, and build effective partnerships with grant makers. Let's go ahead and dig into today's conversation. I'm happy to bring on the North Valley Community Foundation today. The North Valley Community Foundation exists to help impact makers change the world. Through partnership, financial services, training, and education, they are the North Valley's hub for philanthropy, helping individuals, families, businesses, and nonprofits to maximize their impact on the local and global community. Their mission is to fuel healing and compassion for a better world. Today, I'm happy to welcome Alexa Benson-Valavanis, who has served as the president and CEO of the North Valley Community Foundation since 2005. Since then, she has rebuilt the foundation's model, mobilizing social entrepreneurs and philanthropists locally and around the world. Under her leadership, the foundation has grown from serving a dozen clients to more than 500 clients, engaging tens of thousands of donors, generating revenue of more than $152 million, while reinvesting nearly $100 million to causes in Northern California, the US, and throughout the world. Alexa, welcome to today's show. And I'd love for you to kick us off by telling a little bit more about your foundation, the origin story, who you aim to fund today, and anything else you think would be interesting.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here. Sure. So I tend to start when I was hired, which was in 2005. The Community Foundation already existed and had some beautiful projects that it was able to to launch in the world prior to that. But in 2005, when I was hired, straight out of my work in the Guatemalan jungle, and before that on the continent of Asia, I was working in Shanghai and various other places. At that time, the foundation was really challenged to move forward. They weren't sure what direction to take and where they wanted to go. And I had been asked as a 29-year-old with the passion and dream to change the world to look at the business model and see if it was something viable. As I mentioned prior to that, they had conducted some really beautiful projects that were one-offs in our community. And I think had yet to really embrace the concept of a community foundation and what it really could do. So it was the perfect challenge for me. And it was also a wonderful opportunity, I think, for our community to look at the potential of what a strong, robust foundation could do. So what happened basically for the next couple of years was a lot of needs assessment, a lot of just going around, asking people to tea and seeing if they would share with me personally what they wanted to do in the world and what they thought a foundation might help them accomplish. And what I learned was that most people had something really special in their heart that they wanted to do. They didn't need anybody selling them on any concepts or causes in the world. They actually had a dream or a passion to change the world. And what we did from that point on was we just kind of reverse engineered all of those ideas and we built products for them. So if somebody said, I ran into an 8-year-old and she said, I want to help save the orangutans. The orangutans are literally being murdered for palm oil, and I want to help save them. And I asked, well, how are we going to go about doing that? And how are you going to raise money? And she said, well, I'm going to sell used purses. So we built a charitable project fund, which allowed this young girl and her passion to help save orangutans sell purses, put that money in a fund, vet and find the best organizations around the globe that were helping save orangutans and deploy those resources. I also ran into people that said they just wanted to help with the animals here at home. How do we stop, basically the spread of constant animals in our region because we don't have the animals spayed and neutered. We have basically a homeless population of animals here. And they had all sorts of ideas. So we opened up different project funds to allow them to support nonprofit organizations that serve those communities. We ended up meeting with people that had passions on the continent of Africa who wanted to help with making sure people have access to clean water. And what ended up emerging in those early years from 2005 to about 2010 was just loads and loads of funds that were individually the passion and heart of a community member, a community group, or oftentimes, a book club or a women's circle, something of that nature. And I think what happened was people started to trust us and started to understand that they could come to us with the wildest ideas in the world, and that our community foundation was just going to hold them, and they didn't need 2 pennies to their name. We weren't going to have barriers for entry. We weren't going to say you need to put $10,000 in a fund. We weren't going to say we expect you to raise $25K. We were going to say, yeah, go sell a used purse, put that $3 in your fund, and if we can turn around and get that to an organization that helps save orangutans, then you've got a friend in us. And then something really incredibly painful happened. And if you fast forward 13 years from that moment of starting the foundation again, we experienced something called the Camp Fire here in the region. And all of those years of building the trust and the love and respect of our community members came into play. We had grown from just me being the only employee for years with a group of scrappy, passionate board members to 6 employees. And at the time of the Camp Fire, November 8th, 2018, we had 6 employees and we had no work to speak of in fire disaster and recovery. And that what we realized overnight was that we were going to need to transform to become the head of fire relief and recovery in the region. We embraced that challenge. The 6 teammates that I had, the board, and thousands of community members that had embraced us over the years, basically responded to that call. And overnight, we transformed into a disaster relief and recovery organization. And that sort of scrappy social entrepreneur model that I referred to evolved into the largest philanthropic response to a fire disaster in the nation's history. And I think we turned from being that group that allows you to be a charitable repository to raise money through walks and selling cookies to all of a sudden we were an organization that was trusted by grantmakers around the globe. We became the organization that the money went to, that philanthropists gave resources to, that, everybody from Aaron Rodgers, a cherished local community member, to Mark Zuckerberg sent their resources to. And we became a grant-making organization that needed to vet and partner with just various groups on the ground to make sure that our community members could survive this tragedy. And that was kind of that pivotal moment in our history, which is now about 3 years ago, when we turned into a disaster response organization.
That's an incredible story in terms of just the iterative process and the, like you said, the scrappiness and entrepreneurial spirit that you kind of have emanated through multiple years in your organization. It's only from that initial ground base of, working through the needs assessment, understanding and evaluating how to fit different projects and programs to seeking funders that you were able to make such a quick pivot. I'm curious, in sharing a little bit more about your grant making strategy, how would you describe your grant making strategy in the last few years, especially with what happened last year with COVID and other things going on in the world right now? And And how do you guys go about reevaluating or refreshing your grant making strategy, since it is so rapidly changing from what it sounds like in your past experiences?
Well, I think, first of all, it's constantly evolving. I think, I only have our experience to refer to, but what I can share is that the mandate has always been to listen and to learn from those on the ground that are providing the service. So what we try to do is, rather than come in and say we have money and we know what should happen here, is we try and say what is happening here and what are you trying to do to alleviate the suffering, to bring healing, to bring water, to make sure that the babies have diapers. I mean, literally, when you're in disaster response, right, you have all the needs are unmet, and you have trauma and you have chaos. So our approach has been in grant making to listen and to make sure that we have an audience with the right people. When you think about something at the scale and the scope of the largest and deadliest disaster in California history, like the Camp Fire, nobody is doing what they're going to do. Everybody has to invent overnight something because there had not been the fire and the destruction the day before. So everybody we were connecting with was coming up with innovative, creative ideas that hopefully were in a lane where they had credibility and had some sense of, we do this well and we'd like to try and do this. So our job was very similar to all those early years, which was to evaluate the people, not necessarily a track record. So it's different than traditional grant making, where you can look at how long have you been doing this and how have you measured success, and let us point to what we want to accomplish in the world and let's make a match. Ours was very much, are these trusted community members and are they in the right lane, and can we invest in that? Because it was all about betting on new projects. So it's, I think, a different model, but who it might speak to in the audience is more of the entrepreneurial or more of the innovative type grantees that are looking for somebody to take a chance on them. Funders tend to like to be the last couple dollars, of course, because it's the safest and it makes sense, of course, for many reasons. But the North Valley Community Foundation has always been the first dollars. We're the ones that have gone in, which means that we have a heightened need for understanding who it is we're investing in. It puts more responsibility on us to make sure that it's a trusted group of people that we're betting on. And it also means that there isn't a long track record. But when you're a group that transforms overnight to be a disaster relief organization, you also come to the table without any track record. So we took that into account, understanding that we were going to be able to vet these people and these organizations and these ideas, and that overwhelmingly we thought the process was going to allow for success. And I can say, after 3 years and deploying more than 45 million in hundreds and hundreds of grants, that it turned out to work very well, to trust the people at the table and to go off of some of the instincts that made the Community Foundation what it was in the very beginning of its in the beginning of what it became.
And when you're building those relationships and identifying who to trust and whatnot, I'm curious, what is going through what is the evaluation lens for your community foundation? If it is not in like traditional success records, what are potential signs to our listeners as to what they might be able to do to better position their efforts? Because I know that there's actually a pocket of our audience where they are working on, new causes where they don't have as clear of a track record, but they love to find community foundations like you guys. I'm curious if you could share more about what you've seen from those that you've successfully funded and or what you've signaled to your team as important to look for when validating or vetting new relationships with your foundation.
Absolutely. So part of the reason I agreed to doing this podcast, just so that it's about, I deeply believe in the importance of pulling back the curtain. The separation of funding and funders and people making decisions and those on the ground. I mean, to me, that has always been very confusing. And so any opportunity that I can to just make sure everybody has a seat at the table, I'm going to take. And so I just wanted to thank you again for this opportunity. It's not at all mysterious. It's literally the way you conduct your personal life, the way you are with friends and family. It's like, are you a good person that when you leave a room, people are like, I want to be friends with that person. I want to work with that person. They're collaborative. They care. And we vet people. Now, I don't know if that's how other foundations talk, but I'll tell you, when you're in the middle of a disaster and all you're trying to do is find safety for the people around you that you love and care about, and extend that to the strangers in your community that you love and care about, you have to know the person you're working with is going to do what they say and that they are qualified to do the thing that they're saying they're going to do. And so what you do is you literally contact people and say, do you know Jenny? Do you know Bill? We heard he's been working out of the church for 5 years doing distribution to families in need. Is that true? We aren't there. We aren't necessarily in that little pocket in that corner of paradise or in a surrounding community, but you're there. Do you know him? Is this true? And that probably sounds really personal, but it's really personal to us. And then what we did was we built an infrastructure where we had program officers that weren't an email away. They were a phone call away from these funders. They got constant personal attention. And again, if we could do it for something like the campfire, then I would argue that any funder could do it in a community that they're in, because we're talking about thousands of people coming to us saying, we need money, we need money, we need money. And we were willing to be the repository for what turned out to be nearly $100 million in capital that came through. So it's very intimate. And what I would offer to the audience is, it's not business, it's personal. If you're trusted in a community, that's going to come out. If you've done enough to share who you are and what you're trying to accomplish in the world in a more vulnerable way than we tend to see, then the people around you are going to be able to speak on that and speak to that. And so, you can throw around a word like collaboration and whatever that means to people. And I'll tell you, we decided if somebody got funding or not based on whether or not we believe they would collaborate. Because during a disaster, you have to have collaboration. Not that we insisted that they collaborate with partners, but were they collaborative in spirit, or were they competitive, meaning they would do anything for the next opportunity? And that comes down to personal relationships. That comes down to getting to know the people. That comes down to getting to know the organization and their board members and their staff. And so it's a very intimate vetting process. And again, I don't know if this is how other foundations do it, but for us, the criteria, the application process, those are all ways to put kind of black on white writing on paper. But it's going to ultimately come down to, do we trust the people that are representing this organization? Does their community trust them? And do we feel they embrace the spirit of collaboration and partnership that we just absolutely demand out of those that we grant money to?
And for the nonprofit that is looking to establish these sorts of relationships or demonstrate that sort of trust to a community foundation like yours, what have you seen the more proactive ones do ahead of time, ahead of when they actually have a need from a disaster and whatnot, from their end in their proactive efforts of relationship building? Because I know that relationship building in general is a very broad topic that has multiple layers, and I'm curious what you guys have found particularly effective in expediting the point in which you can trust somebody in your community, and what they can do on their end to also support that process being as fast as possible so that they can really get towards the impact.
Yeah. So again, I would just put it back to like personal behavior. It's like, are you doing everything in your life where are you your best? And that means when you tell somebody you're going to call them back, when you promise to go to an event, when you have some sort of shared partnership, are you building the kind of relationships that later somebody can look at and say, oh, that's one I want to mention. but are you just building them because that's the kind of person you are and the kind of organization you are? So it's the long road is what I'm referring to. Long before you ask a funder for money, long before you respond to a disaster and say, hey, we can do this thing. It's all those years when nobody was looking at you, your behavior as the leader, as a board member, as a staff member, it's that behavior that actually we're looking at, not what you did, or did you send the right emails, or did you make the right calls? But if you were then to be able to pull back the curtain and say, but what kind of organization is this? What kind of leaders do they have? Are they trusted? That's nothing you can hack. That's just who you are, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, again, these aren't typically the conversations that I have during the course of a workday, but what I would say is, are you working on you? Is your staff being given time, energy, and resources to really be their best selves? Because at the end of the day, I think when we're given a choice to partner and collaborate versus to compete and tear down, our human nature is going to be to collaborate and work together. And so it's about the culture of an organization. It's about the people you're attracting. Those are the things the North Valley Community Foundation is actually looking at. And it's nothing you can kind of piece together in a couple of weeks or months before you apply for a grant. It's like, what is your DNA as an organization? Do you sometimes do the thing that is not in your very best interest, but it's in the best interest of the 5 people at the table because it's the right thing to do? That's far more interesting to me, and you're far more likely to get my vote than the one that's just trying to prove that they're, the shiniest object. So all long-term stuff, like what is the DNA and the soul of your organization? And if it's new, that's great too. But what's guiding it? What's driving it? Like what's the core, what can we hold on to and know that that's you? And, we talk business strategy all the time. And at the end of the day, a business is just made up of people. Like literally, it's just made up of humans. So who are those people? And have they taken the time to email back? Have they taken the time to articulate the passion and the fire in their own heart and why they're part of an organization? Like, has the organization taken the time to do that back with its employees? That's the stuff I care about, because, and maybe you've been through one, maybe you haven't, but when you go through something like a disaster, you realize that nothing matters except for trusting the person in front of you, that they care about what they're saying they care about, and that you can count on them to do what they say they're going to do. When people need water and shelter, and then you have something like COVID hit on top of it, you have to trust the person in front of you. And all grant making is stewardship of trust. It's just, I have something, you have something, and we're going to exchange that. And oftentimes it's, we have resources and you have heart, hands, and expertise and wisdom. It's just an exchange of trust. So, I wish I could ramble off like the 10 things that I personally look for, but I'll tell you, it's really just, is it who you are? Are you a trusted person? Is your organization a trusted organization? Have you harmed a lot of people along the way? Have you tried to tear down instead of build up around you? Like, those things become very obvious if that's what you're looking for. And the North Valley Community Foundation is definitely looking for that.
Before we head into the second portion of today's conversation with Alexa Benson-Valavanis, we wanted to tell you about Instrumentl. Instrumentl helps grant seekers bring grant prospecting, tracking, and management into one place. If you'd like to give Instrumentl a try, you can create a free account at www.instrumentl.com and get personalized grant recommendations for your nonprofit. In the case where you're ready to upgrade your account, you can save $50 off your first month by using the code Foundation50. Nonprofits that use Instrumentl increase their grant applications by 78% within a year of using us. Now, back to the episode. It sounds like something that's really important that would also carry over into the grant application as well is the narrative. It's the storytelling as well. And so I'm curious if you can speak to a past grantee who had a great crafting of their narrative? What makes that one stand out when you think about all of the different opportunities that you've funded before? And what can somebody take away from that example that comes to mind?
Well, the first thing I'd say is we actually do build, we demystify a little bit of what I'm talking about, because I understand it's a little esoteric, but we ask for who are your partners. We ask for specific evidence of the things that I'm asking to see and that we're asking to see. We craft that in the form of sentences like, can you give us 3 or 4 partners that can speak to your collaborative nature? And so when it comes to the narrative and the storytelling, oftentimes, let me think of a couple of examples, because so much of it with the fire was innovative, what we had was an example of how they innovated to solve a problem in the world that wasn't like a disaster, but that we could look at the framework of that problem solving and say that could apply. And the narrative might be, I'm thinking of a group called From the Ground Up. This is a group that prior to the fire, they were doing completely different things in their community, very small grassroots efforts, but they demonstrated through the application process, and then more importantly, through our vetting of that, so us contacting the people that they offered and us learning about them, they demonstrated that they were a trusted partner in their community and that they understood the resources there and could get things to the people in need. And we went all in on this group, a very, like I said, a very grassroots group based on this narrative that they presented, that they were of the community and for the community and that we could trust them. Things, like buying them a chipper so that we have all these trees that have burned and they're hazards, they're dangerous, but we need to create jobs and we need to have these trees cut down. And we've got major challenges around these disasters, and they knew what to do and they knew how to do it. And they came up with the concepts and the ideas and what we needed to do, again, not to put too fine a point on it, but since we aren't the ones that are going to do all the work, what we need to do was trust the person or the organization that we were funding, that they actually had the stakeholders and that they had the audience and that they were speaking on behalf of a community and not just themselves or their ideas. So I would say, to me, narrative is very important, that the storytelling component, we don't think of ourselves as salesy, I think, when it comes to trying to get money. But ultimately, you're sharing and selling a story that you need their attention and you need them to believe that story and you need them to believe in what you're saying. And that's where the sales comes in. I think you can't spend too much time on crafting your story as long as it's grounded in the truth and it's authentic. I would say we need to spend a lot of time on storytelling because that's actually what moves the human heart oftentimes. And yes, we have all sorts of ways of evaluating criteria, and we can quantify everything, and we can come up with systems in which we can say this one's we believe the success rate of this one's going to be high, but at the end of the day, it's a story. There's a leap of faith. Like I said, there's an exchange of trust there and stewardship, and I think storytelling is the most important part of an application.
On the topic of storytelling, I'm curious about the grantees who might be returning to you for funding, so multi-year grants. I'm curious if you evaluate those renewing in a different fashion than those that might be new. And I'm also curious if you could speak to how important grant reporting is in your evaluation and renewing funding, and in general, what you've noticed in terms of overall patterns of the grantees who are returning versus new grantees within your constituents.
Yeah, I think there's some subtle differences, but we have very high expectations for our grantees in terms of how they share the partnership. Again, because it's a disaster, I would just say that when you have the whole world for a while, and certainly the state and the region looking at you, we had a major obligation to make sure people knew where the money was going and how we were spending it. the North Valley Community Foundation only took 1 penny on the dollar. So that meant 99 cents of every dollar we raised was going to go right back in the community. And we needed the grantees to tell that story effectively. And yet they're not marketing companies. They're not media firms. They're grassroots disaster relief group organizations, So we came alongside them and made sure they understood and were supported in sharing their story, and that we could also amplify the work that they were doing on our social media channels and on our platforms. So it's not just a single report. It is the moment we connect with you and partner with you, you are of the North Valley Community Foundation family, which means we're going to be sharing what you're doing on our social media channels. We're going to be watching what you're doing and how you're sharing the story of your work 365 days a year, which might seem intense if it's a $5,000 grant, but we wanted to know that the money was going out and reducing suffering, and we needed to know it in real time. And of course, we've built in an annual summaries, and we've had opportunities to make sure that when it's a more sophisticated grant process, to make sure money was deployed in certain ways, if there were restrictions, all that's in place. But at the highest level, it's, are you taking the time to thank those that are sharing the resources? I'm speaking like as a grantee. Are you telling the story of the work through your channels so that people really can get a handle of what you're doing and how their investment has gone into your work? And that's something that our program officers are monitoring. That's something our communications department is monitoring. Because like I said, when you have millions of dollars pour in and everybody's saying, where's it going? Where's it going? We did not have a big enough voice to just do all that talking. We needed all our grantees to tell what they were doing. And then we tried to amplify it. And that became an evaluation tool. We were able to then, when they came back for more money, have a massive track record of that storytelling to say, wow, when we invested 10,000 in this group, this is what they accomplished. And a report would tell us that. But we have a massive track record of their Instagram that showed when they arrived somewhere, when they distributed the waters, the reaction of people to them when they saw their brand show up at a shelter, rescue missions for the animals from the fire. I mean, with social media today, you should be talking to your funders all day long, in my opinion. You should be building relationships with them every opportunity you can. You don't need to constantly be tagging them. You should just, again, it goes back to you being you, the organization being the organization, and the funders, if they're tuned in enough, and I'm sure they all are, they'll be paying attention and watching. And then by the time it's like, oh, you owe us a report, that's like, to me, nothing. Yeah, of course you do. We have to have it on a file or an e-version or whatever, but we've been watching you for 365 days. We know darn well if you've been doing all that work. We know how the community feels about you. And when you ask us for another 25 or 50,000, it is no question whether or not you're getting that if you're a trusted partner. So that would be my 2 cents on kind of cultivating gratitude and information to your funders about, like, what are you doing with the money that they've invested in? And I would do it for donors the same I would do it for large funders. I would treat everybody the same, which is just share how their work with you is getting out in the world by talking about it, sharing the stories, telling people what you're up to.
I think it all goes back to the 2 core themes so far, which is, be who you are in terms of your organization. And then secondly, craft the narrative and continue to tell that narrative and be okay and authentic in terms of sharing that 365 days in the year as well. I'm curious.
Just to say, to live up to your own, it kind of sets a standard for yourself, which we do this at the Community Foundation. It was 10:30 in the morning on November 8th when the fire struck, and we opened up a fund. We had no idea what we were getting into. We just thought it was like going to be another fire like so many we've experienced now. And by that evening, we had already agreed to announce every single grant online that we made. This is like, I'd never heard of anyone doing this, but we understood that the world was watching what was happening in the campfire. It was so bad. By the third day, we had already issued our first 10 grants to the shelters, and we were doing in real time posts of the grants we were making, which means, it's like a full-time job on top of what you're doing. So what I'm saying is it's not easy what I'm suggesting. It's a lot of work. But if you're able to say, we value storytelling, we value sharing this, it's hard because it might mean we do 2 less things today that we really want to do and we're in the middle of a disaster. Or it's 2 less runs to get animals off the ridge. Or, there are real consequences to spending time storytelling. But what I'm suggesting is, if you can prioritize it in the long run, it will allow more people to come to your table. It will allow more people to understand who you really are and what you're doing in the community. And it's a path to connection that I think ultimately will have the long-term financial dividends that you're looking for, even though, I'm sure the audience listening, because I know people in the nonprofit sector, and I know we'll do anything. We're going to sacrifice time, heart, energy, whatever, because we want to just do that next thing to help. So sometimes there are some sacrifices, which is we're going to do one less thing in the world, but we're going to share what we're doing. And it's hard, but it's important.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of disasters, obviously something that's impacted all of us is COVID. And I'm curious, in your opinion, what trends have you noticed emerging in terms of the relationship between grant seekers and grant makers since last year began and the pandemic continues? And how do you think COVID has impacted the ideas around unrestricted support grants?
Love all these questions. Actually, I should do more of these. This is fun. For us, it was validation of the way we do our grants. So what we don't want to do is tell you how to do your job. What we want to do is see if we trust you to do your job. And the fires illustrated that to the nth degree because people had to innovate, but COVID as well. Instead of telling organizations how they should spend money, we asked them, what would money do to help you get through this nightmare of COVID-19, which has just been, for us on top of the fire, it's just hard to even explain what these community members have been going through. And I know so many in our world are going through so much, but here to have literally just stood up from a fire like the campfire to then be hit with COVID-19, it's just been trauma upon trauma. So what we didn't want to do is come in and tell organizations how they should use money. And you're getting the theme from me, which is to listen. That's our job. As grantors, our primary job is to listen first, and then to gather wisdom and resources and expertise and help guide, of course, second. So that's what we did. We put out applications that basically said, tell us where the suffering is and how money could help alleviate that. And overwhelmingly, it was, mental health. Overwhelming, it was like our staff. Yes, we did deploy resources early on and build partnerships early on for things like mask production, supporting our hospitals. Absolutely. But I think the grants I'm the most proud of are the ones where we just said, what do you need to keep going? Like, how can we help provide some oxygen in this environment? And they said things like, we need to bring in some counseling. We could use a day where we just sent our staff to, healing, massage, activities for their mental, emotional, and spiritual health. So unrestricted money to me should be the norm and not the exception. If you trust the person in front of you, if you trust the organization in front of you, then the more restrictions in my mind, the more limiting their behavior, and the worse the results. So that's, I'm sure, a pretty radical view, but that's the view at the Community Foundation. It's all about going in on the partnership and the trust, and removing as many restrictions as possible. I'll tell you, as a grantee, the North Valley Community Foundation was given money from the California Community Foundation during the fire. we don't get through the campfire without a funder like them investing in us. And because one penny on the dollar was never going to allow us to do what we needed to do. So we're not just grantors, we're a grantee. We know what it's like to be trying to share our authentic self and who we really are to somebody that doesn't know us. And so everything I'm sharing as from the perspective of, maybe on this side of the table, I just would want your audience to know, like, this is who we are as, in that position, that challenging and humble position of being able to say, thank you for your time. And can I just share with you what we're trying to accomplish? And then trying to get just the hope that somebody will believe in you and what you're saying. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, I think the more unrestricted the capital, we simply couldn't have done what we did if there were tons of strings attached on how we were going to do it. And so I'm grateful to the other funders out there, and I know there's millions of them that believe in what I'm sharing and preaching today, which is that we have to trust. And if you trust, that means certainly you want evidence of how they did it and you want to learn what they did. But if you trust somebody, you shouldn't have to be standing over their shoulder.
Mm-hmm. Alexa, do you have any final thoughts that you think would be helpful to share to any grant seeker that's listening today?
Well, I'm all about the hustle. So what I believe is if you want to partner with somebody, then you find 10 people on that team and DM them, and you call, and if you can, and it's safe and there aren't COVID restrictions, you stop by and you actually build the relationships again, like you would in your personal life. If you really wanted to have the attention of somebody in your personal life, then you'd probably call more than once without getting your feelings hurt. You'd probably stop by, you'd probably send the email. In a context like this, I'm doing a lot of talking, but when you're building relationships, it's important to do a lot of listening. It's important to validate and hear and learn and listen to the experience in front of you. So those are, to me, it's all about who are you, and are you using those same guiding principles that you use in your everyday life as a grantee? And those are the things that I would just carry on doing. If you really want to get the attention of a funder in your community, then constantly be calling them and not just talking about yourself, like call to learn about them. One of the pitfalls I think that we fall into, because we get so passionate about what we're doing, is just going all in on us all the time instead of taking the time to learn about them. So if I'm a grantee, I want to learn all about the funder. What's important to them? What's their DNA? Listening. So it goes both ways, As funders, I think we have an obligation to listen. As grantees, I think we have an obligation to listen. Like, we all should be spending about 80% of our time on the person in front of us. There will be a time to tell your mission. There'll be a time to tell your vision. There'll be a time to sell what you're going to sell. But I think it's really important that we treat these things like we treat relationships, which is sometimes we just got to listen for a little while first. So see if you can get somebody that you can listen to on the other end of the line, and really care about what they're trying to accomplish in the world. And if it's a match, it's a match. And if it's not, don't lose sleep over it. On to the next one. That'd be the advice.
I think that really speaks to just being compassionate, right? Fundamentally. So thank you so much for hopping on today to this conversation, Alexa. If you'd like to learn more about the North Valley Community Foundation, you can check out their website at nvcf.org. This concludes today's conversation with Alexa Benson-Valavanis. If you enjoyed this conversation with this Grantmaker, be sure to check out our other ones in this series. And if you haven't already, be sure to sign up for an Instrumentl account to get personalized grant recommendations for your nonprofit. Just access www.instrumentl.com to see your results today.